Okay, welcome back one more time to the third book, The Hammer and the Anvil, will be the reading for this segment from the Sign of the Times trilogy. It is the third and final book, and it is set in the 1920s, where we had interesting things happen at the beginning of the 1920s, right there in the year 1920. Prohibition was enacted, which made it illegal to drink alcohol in the United States, and then also women were given the right to vote in 1920. So those events certainly impact this story, and they are talked about in the newspaper office, where we see really in this book the joining of these two families that have been described throughout the trilogy. The Standlin family, Peter Standlin, has been running the Mercerville News for a number of years. Now his son, who we meet as a child in the book Rachel, is a grown man. Morgan Standlin is now helping his father run the newspaper, and they are discussing the events that have been taking place over the year and the last few years. And that is part of how this trilogy helps teach history through literature, where they are in the newspaper office talking about these events, which really actually took place. And then we have Rachel and James, the Colliers, come in. They are working there, and they talk about how they're going to proceed with this year-end edition they're putting together. So one more time from chapter 6 of The Hammer and the Anvil. This is today's reading, and we will see how these characters are doing at this point. Okay, Peter walked into the office and hung his coat and scarf on the coat stand. He looked over at Morgan and nodded approvingly. "You're here early, getting those events sorted out for the year-end edition?" Morgan shook his head yes, as he read an article from the summer about the Olympics that had been held that year in Belgium. The countries of Hungary, Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire were banned from the Games due to their being blamed for their roles in starting the Great War. The Soviet Union had not attended the Olympic Games due to the turmoil in their country, which had been in since the aftermath of the war. The United States won the most medals. Morgan spoke as he looked at the paper. The women's swim team won 7 of those medals. Peter chuckled as he walked back to his desk. This was a big year for women. You may want to dedicate a page just for the women in there. It might be a good way to organize it, Morgan answered him, looking at some of the other newspapers on the table. I was thinking of putting the presidential election on the front page. I think that, along with women getting the right to vote, were the biggest events of the year. I think from a news standpoint they were. Peter sat down behind his desk and cleaned his glasses. Prohibition was enacted, but that might be best left off the front page. There has been a war going on in Ireland. He looked at Morgan, who shook his head no at what his father said. I think people have heard enough about war. I know it's important, but I was hoping to be more cheerful. There was a bombing on Wall Street by the anarchists. I don't think we need to mention that again. Maybe mention the World Series. The team from Cleveland won. Last year, the Chicago Black Sox cheated and threw the series. Now they call them the White Sox. Sports has become big business. Peter replaced his glasses on his face, and when big money is involved, it becomes dirty business. I was thinking you may want to dedicate a page to the inventions that came out this year. I went over to the office of the Dispatch when I went to Pittsburgh and heard a news broadcast on the radio. Morgan looked at his father with half a smile, but changed his expression back to serious and looked at the papers on the conference table. The office door opened at that moment, and James and Rachel entered. Morgan looked up and called to James, "In here!" They both walked into Peter's office and into the conference room. "James, what would you say was the greatest invention ever?" "To date?" James thought for a moment. "Has to be the airplane. I mean, what has man wanted longer than to be able to fly?" They all considered his answer, and Morgan asked Rachel, "What do you say, Rachel? What was the greatest invention ever?" Rachel considered the question as she removed the woolen scarf from around her neck and looked back through the doorway of Peter's office at the printing press that remained in the front window, no longer hidden by the poster of Uncle Sam, which had hung there during the war. I think the printing press was the greatest invention ever. I mean, it doesn't look like much, and it doesn't fly, but after it was invented in the 1400s, it took us out of the Dark Ages and gave rise to the Renaissance. Because of the widespread printing of Bibles, many people who did not attend school, like my mother, learned how to read from the family Bible. That is how she taught us until we went to school when your mother was the teacher there. She pointed at Morgan, who smiled at mention of his mother being the school teacher in Mercerville. Now his sister was the school teacher. Always nice to hear from the teacher in the room, Morgan said, looking again at the papers on the table. Dad suggested we do a page for women in the year-end edition. He looked up at Rachel. You want to put that together? Is that what we're calling it, the year-end edition? Rachel asked. Some publications call it the year-end review, Peter answered her. But that's a good idea. You do the page for women. Consider it your first assignment, coming back to the paper. Rachel smiled as she heard Peter's words. He looked at James. I was hoping you would do a page about sports, James. We spoke about doing more sports, and this will be a good way to introduce readers to the sports page. Peter emphasized his words with his hands out in front of him, imagining the banner headline at the top of the sports page announcing the year in sports. There are over a dozen baseball stadiums in the big cities now, and it's only getting bigger. James answered him. The Cleveland Indians won the World Series. They beat the Brooklyn Robins. But I'm waiting for them to bring a football team to Pittsburgh. They played the first season of professional football this year, and I heard that Pittsburgh will be getting a team. Maybe by next year. I heard they're going to call the team the Pirates. Rachel looked at him. I thought that was the name of the baseball team. The football team will be the Pirates also. How original. Rachel allowed a smile to curl her lip. Is football like kickball? She asked. The children used to play that in front of the school during recess. You don't know how they play football? James asked, not believing her. They kick the ball? Rachel rolled her eyes at her obvious response. Yes, sometimes, but they can throw it also because the ball isn't round. The ball isn't round? She almost laughed at her response. No, it's kind of oblong shaped, and you throw it by rolling it off the end of your fingers, but most of the time they hold it in their hands and run with it. Most of the time they hold it in their hands and run with it, or maybe throw it, and they call it football. Well, when you say it like that, James shook his head, knowing Rachel had no use for sports. I'll do the page about women. She went to the table and started looking through the piles of newspapers. Morgan looked over at James. Make sure to include the Olympics that were held this year. In that edition, we can put in a picture of the Olympic flag with the 5 interlocking rings of unity. He thought to himself a moment, then continued, you remember Jim Thorpe, right? Of course. James looked back at him. He played football this year for the Canton Bulldogs. Well, you can mention that in the sports page. I doubt I'll pay much attention to the Olympics after what the Olympic Committee did to Jim Thorpe in the 1912 games. I remember that, James said, after he won 4 different events and got gold medals for them. The committee said that because he had been paid to play minor league baseball in 1909 and 1910, he violated the amateur status rules for athletes, and they took away his medals and his Olympic records. That's right. Morgan shook his head in agreement. I always wondered if they did that to make sure other athletes followed the rules, or because Thorpe made all the other athletes look bad. Was he the only athlete to play professional sports outside of the Olympics? Rachel asked, looking up from the stack of papers. Not likely, Morgan answered her, but he was the only American Indian who competed in that Olympics, or the only one to ever win a gold medal. Rachel looked back at the newspaper, shaking her head. So much for the interlocking rings of unity.